Welcome to MindWire Podcast, where we connect the dots between complex ideas and everyday life. Plug in, tune out the noise, and let's rewire the way we think today. So imagine, if you will, sitting down to play a game of Monopoly.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. But before the first die is even cast, half the players already have hotels on Boardwalk. They have them on Park Place.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty rough start.
Exactly. And they get to roll like 3 times per turn, and they start with 10 times the cash.
Yeah, that game is basically over before it begins.
Right. But here's the kicker. When those players inevitably win the game, they don't look at the board and say, wow, I had a massive structural advantage.
No, of course not.
No. They write a best-selling book on how their superior, unique dice rolling technique is the absolute key to winning.
Yeah, the secret is all in the wrist, right?
Exactly. And that is what today is all about. Today, we are taking a massive deep dive into the actual science of success.
It's such a vital conversation to have.
It really is. We are moving past the cultural mythology of the self-made man. You know, the lone genius in the garage, the CEO who supposedly hustled their empire into existence through sheer grit. We're throwing that out and looking at the hard data.
Yeah, mainly because that seductive narrative of the self-made individual, it's really the bedrock of how we understand meritocracy today.
Right, the idea that you get exactly what you deserve.
Exactly. The story implies absolute control over our own destinies. Like, if you fail, well, it's because you just didn't work hard enough. And if you succeed, it's because you were brilliant.
Which is incredibly convenient for the people who succeed.
Very convenient. But our mission today is to systematically deconstruct the multidimensional determinants of success. And we're doing this based on an enormous synthesis of cognitive, psychosocial, structural, and cultural source material.
And I really want to emphasize to you, the listener, that we aren't just looking at one angle here.
No, not at all.
Ooh. Whether you're trying to ace a degree, climb the corporate ladder, or you're just trying to figure out why your incredibly smart friend is stuck in a rut while someone seemingly less capable is flying high, this deep dive is going to give you those aha moments.
Definitely will.
Think of it as a shortcut to being deeply well-informed. For generations, we've been told the recipe for success only requires 2 ingredients, right? A pinch of talent and a whole lot of elbow grease.
Right. Just put your head down and work.
Yeah. But the source material reveals a hidden ingredient list that is, frankly, staggering.
It is staggering. I mean, the contemporary scientific analysis, and this is drawing from cognitive psychology, behavioral economics, and sociology, it shows us that success emerges from a highly intricate, dynamic, and often radically asymmetrical interaction between different forces.
Radically asymmetrical. I like that. So what are we actually looking at today?
Well, we are going to explore the biological hardware we're born with, the psychological software we program ourselves with, the daily behavioral architectures we build, the invisible social ecosystems we swim in, and finally,
the big one.
Yes, the heavily underestimated role of pure blind luck.
Man, I can't wait to get into that. But let's start right at the foundation.
Sure.
Before we look at the environment or the network or the luck, we have to look at the individual themselves, the biological and cognitive baseline.
Right, the hardware.
Exactly. When we look at the predictive analysis of success, whether that's getting a PhD, having a long career, generating wealth, what does the data actually say about the raw hardware of the human brain?
Historically, and even in the most modern, rigorous meta-analyses, the predictive power heavily relies on measuring intellectual capacity, specifically a concept called GMA, or general mental ability.
Okay, let me stop you right there, because when people hear mental ability or intelligence, they immediately think of an IQ test.
Right.
Or they think of the person who can memorize the entire Wikipedia page on the Roman Empire. We're not talking about being a human encyclopedia, right?
No, far from it. I mean, GMA is often conceptualized by the G factor, which is a construct identified over a century ago. And while an IQ test approximates it, the real essence of GMA is cognitive plasticity.
Cognitive plasticity, meaning what exactly?
It is your capacity to manage and navigate cognitive complexity. Think of it as the speed at which you can take entirely abstract information, manipulate it, spot structural similarities between wildly different concepts, and assimilate new paradigms.
So, to use a tech analogy, it's the processor speed, not the hard drive storage.
I like that.
It's not how many files you have saved in your brain, it's how fast your brain can render a completely new, incredibly complex 3D environment.
That is a highly functional way to visualize it. It dictates your adaptability.
Hmm.
And in an increasingly sophisticated, rapidly shifting work environment, your processor speed is paramount.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
And the data from our sources is unequivocal on this, even though it can be an uncomfortable truth in our modern discourse. We hear a lot of popular narratives championing soft skills,
Oh, constantly. The idea that being a nice, collaborative person who just puts their head down and grinds will always beat out raw, unadulterated intellect.
Exactly, sometimes implying that anyone can achieve anything if they just have the right attitude and work ethic. Yet, longitudinal analyses reaffirm the supremacy of cognitive ability over many of those other variables.
Okay, give me an example from the source material.
Well, the sources highlight a highly robust piece of research. It's the Zisman and Ganzak study from 2020. They utilized data from the NLSY97 cohort.
The National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, right?
Yes,
Right.
and this wasn't just some small laboratory experiment. It involved 6,748 participants.
Wow, so a highly representative sample of the American population.
Extremely representative. And what they did was track these individuals from their teenage years into adulthood.
And what were they actually measuring with these thousands of people?
As teenagers, their cognitive abilities were tested with the AFQT, which is a rigorous aptitude test. Years later, the researchers methodically compared the predictive power of that baseline intelligence against their pure perseverance.
What society commonly refers to as grit or sheer effort.
Exactly.
I read this part of the notes, and the disparity in the numbers actually made me do a double take. Walk us through what they found regarding educational success.
Sure. So the researchers conducted a variance analysis. In statistics, when you want to know how much a specific trait contributes to an outcome, you look at the unique variance it explains.
Okay, I'm with you.
The data showed that a person's intelligence explained an astonishing 48 to 90 times more unique variance in their educational success than their perseverance did.
Wait, 48 to 90 times more.
Yes, and we're talking about concrete outcomes here, like high school GPA or graduating from a four-year university.
Let me just repeat that for the listener because it completely shatters the cultural narrative. 48 to 90 times more unique variance.
It's massive.
That means when you strip away the background noise, the raw computing power of the brain is driving the academic outcome to a degree that makes sheer effort look almost statistically insignificant in comparison.
The magnitude of the difference really is profound. And the thing is, it doesn't stop at the university gates. It translates directly into the labor market.
Oh, really? How so?
When predicting empirical financial success, specifically measured by hourly wages later in life, general intelligence had 13 times more predictive power than perseverance.
13 times more. That is a really heavy reality to process.
It is.
But let's add some nuance here. If intelligence is the processor, something still has to tell that processor what to focus on, right? I mean, a supercomputer left in a dark room doing nothing is totally useless.
Absolutely. And this is where personality comes in. Your personality structure acts as the essential interface between your raw cognitive potential and your tangible, real-world execution.
Okay, so what's the best way to measure that personality?
The most empirically validated framework we have in psychology for this is the Big Five personality matrix.
Just to refresh everyone, that's openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
Exactly. And when we isolate the non-cognitive champion of success, the trait that reliably pushes that processor to actually achieve one trait reigns supreme above all the others.
Which one?
Conscientiousness.
Ah, the planners.
Yeah.
The people who color code their digital calendars.
Yes, the organizers. Conscientiousness encompasses a really wide spectrum of behaviors. We're talking about acute organization, reliability, self-discipline, the ability to delay gratification.
And just a relentless orientation toward long-term goals. Right?
Exactly. The meta-analyses in our sources show that conscientiousness alone can explain up to 28% of the variance in academic performance.
28%.
Yes, and crucially, this is completely independent of cognitive ability.
Okay, so this explains a phenomenon we've all seen. This is why the student with perfectly average intelligence, who maps out their study schedule meticulously over 3 months, they will eventually systematically surpass the absolute genius who relies on their raw processor speed to write their term paper at 2:00 a.m. the night before it's due.
Yes, because the labor market and educational institutions do not just reward abstract reasoning. They reward the internalization of work norms, reliability, and consistent execution.
So true. I mean, the genius who misses the deadline produces zero value.
Exactly. But the conscientious average earner who delivers consistently, they produce compounding value over time.
That makes perfect sense. I want to push back on this a little, though, or at least explore a contradiction.
Okay, what are you thinking?
Well, we constantly hear that in today's modern team-based economy, being a nice, highly collaborative person is the ultimate key to rising up the ranks.
Right, the team player.
But looking at the source material, specifically the OECD study, the SSES 2023 report, there is a finding regarding agreeableness that feels incredibly counterintuitive.
It really is. It is one of the more jarring findings for people who believe the market rewards moral virtue.
Break it down for us. What did the OECD do?
The OECD tracked massive cohorts across 16 international sites. We're talking ranging from Finland to Japan to the United Arab Emirates. They were looking at how these big five traits correlate with actual life outcomes.
And here's where it gets really interesting. They found that high agreeableness, which means being highly compassionate, highly cooperative, the ultimate team player who avoids conflict, is actually negatively correlated with financial income.
Yes.
How does that make any sense?
It really comes down to the mechanics of value capture versus value creation.
Okay, explain that difference.
Well, being highly agreeable makes you a beloved team member. It facilitates social integration and makes the office a very pleasant place to be. So you are creating value for the group.
Right, everyone loves working with you.
Exactly. However, it becomes a severe liability when it comes time for you to capture the financial value you just created.
Oh. Because they won't fight for the money. They don't want to rock the boat.
Exactly that. Highly agreeable individuals consistently fail to assert themselves aggressively during salary negotiations.
Yeah, I can totally picture that.
Right. When faced with a boss who says, we can't quite manage that raise this year, the agreeable person prioritizes social harmony over their own financial compensation. They back down to avoid the interpersonal friction.
Wow, that's a tough pill to swallow. And what about the other traits?
Conversely, the same study shows that extroversion has a strong positive correlation with income.
Why is that?
Because extroverts naturally build social capital. They network effectively, and they comfortably navigate the power dynamics required to access leadership roles.
Makes sense. And on the flip side of emotional stability, the sources note that neuroticism is heavily penalized.
Inevitably. Neuroticism is characterized by emotional instability, high anxiety, and vulnerability to stress.
And businesses don't like that.
No, in a high-stakes professional environment, emotional instability generates productivity disruptions. The market ruthlessly rewards a steady, resilient temperament.
So if I'm building a slightly ruthless summary of the hardware required for success based strictly on the data,
Let's hear it.
you want a high processing speed, which is GMA. You want the discipline to focus that processor, which is conscientiousness. You want the extroversion to sell your results to others. And you need to be just disagreeable enough to demand what you're actually worth without apologizing for it.
That is a very pragmatic synthesis, but it perfectly sets up the next logical question.
Which is?
Having the hardware is one thing. You can have the processor, and you can have the conscientiousness to turn it on. But how do you actually program yourself to care about the work over the span of a 40-year career?
Right, you need the drive.
Exactly. This requires transitioning from innate traits, which are relatively fixed, to malleable psychological frameworks, the software of drive.
Motivation. Basically, how do we want to do the work, and how do we acquire the expertise to do it well?
The foundational framework we must explore here is self-determination theory, or SDT. It was developed by Richard Ryan and Edward Deci.
Okay, SDT. Why is it so important?
Within the field of psychology, their work essentially triggered a paradigm shift regarding how we view human drive.
What did they overthrow? What was the prevailing thought before they came along?
They systematically dismantled the dominant behaviorist dogma of the 20th century.
Behaviorism, like B.F. Skinner and his pigeons.
Exactly. Behaviorism essentially viewed humans as simple input-output machines. It argued that the absolute best way to optimize human performance was through a rigid external system of carrots and sticks.
Meaning, do this task and get a bonus. Fail this task and get fired. The classic corporate management model.
Precisely the model. But FDT proved that this behaviorist approach is deeply, fundamentally flawed when it comes to sustaining high-level complex success.
So the carrot and stick doesn't work.
Ryan and Deci demonstrated that human motivation shouldn't just be measured by its quantity, meaning how much effort you are visibly exerting in the moment. It must be measured by its quality.
This resonates so much. I like to compare external rewards, like a rigid deadline, a fear of your boss yelling at you, or even a massive cash bonus tied to a specific metric, to putting cheap, highly combustible fuel into a high-performance engine.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
Right. It might make the engine rev incredibly fast for a short sprint, but it creates all this carbon buildup. Over the long term, it literally destroys the engine. It corrodes your internal desire to do the work.
That analogy maps perfectly onto the neuroscience of motivation. FDT places motivation on a spectrum.
What does that spectrum look like?
On the far left, you have pure motivation, a state of doing nothing, feeling completely helpless. Moving to the right, you enter extrinsic motivation, which itself has different tiers.
Okay, break those down.
At its lowest tier, it's acting purely to get a tangible reward or avoid a punishment. A bit higher up is acting to protect your ego, or avoid internal guilt-like studying just so you don't look foolish in front of your peers.
Yeah, I've definitely been there.
Higher still is understanding the value of a task, even if you don't intrinsically love it.
And then at the far right of the spectrum,
You reach pure intrinsic motivation. This is acting out of pure curiosity, deep interest, and the inherent joyful satisfaction of the task itself.
the holy grail of motivation.
Absolutely. The research unequivocally shows that sustainable success, high-quality learning, and true creative innovation are intimately linked to this autonomous motivation.
Because they're doing it for the love of the game.
Exactly. Individuals driven by intrinsic forces show vastly superior resilience to failure, because the failure isn't a threat to their survival or their ego. It's just a puzzle to be solved.
That is so powerful. But practically speaking, how do we get there? If I'm a manager listening to this, or a teacher, or just someone trying to motivate myself to learn a new skill, how do I actually build that high-quality intrinsic drive?
Yeah.
Because I can't just command someone to be curious.
No, you cannot command it. But you can cultivate the environment for it. SDT identifies 3 fundamental, non-negotiable human psychological needs that must be nourished by an environment for intrinsic motivation to flourish.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is autonomy. This is the profound feeling that you are the author of your own actions, that you have meaningful choice, and that you are not under coercive control.
Which means micromanagement isn't just annoying, it is literally killing the psychological drive to succeed. Like when a boss tells you exactly how to write an email, they are stripping away your autonomy.
It is lethal to intrinsic motivation. The moment a behavior is externally controlled, the perceived locus of causality shifts from inside the person to outside. A passionate behavior instantly transforms into a laborious obligation.
Wow. Okay, what's the second need?
The second core need is competence. This is the feeling of effectiveness. It's the belief that you possess or can acquire the necessary expertise to overcome the challenges in front of you.
Is that a big factor?
Meta-analyses show this is actually the strongest predictor of self-determined motivation.
Makes sense. We fundamentally like doing things we feel we are good at, or at least capable of mastering.
Naturally. And the third need is relatedness, or social belonging.
Meaning the people around us.
Yes, this is the feeling of being connected to, understood by, and supported by a community. When an environment provides autonomy, competence, and relatedness, the human being naturally gravitates toward high-level performance.
Okay, so that's the established science of motivation. But I know our sources take a pretty sharp scalpel to some of the modern buzzwords we hear constantly in pop psychology, HR seminars, and TED Talks.
They certainly do.
Specifically, I'm talking about the concepts of grit and growth mindset.
The source material does indeed drop what we might call a methodological bombshell on these highly popular concepts. Let's start with grit.
Okay, popularized by Angela Duckworth, right? Defined as the passion and perseverance for very long-term goals.
Yes. Over the last decade, it has been sold to the public as a magical force, equal to or even greater than IQ.
The narrative is everywhere. It doesn't matter how smart you are. If you just never give up, if you just have enough grit, you will inevitably win.
Right. Intellectually and emotionally, it's a beautiful egalitarian idea. But methodologically, it is highly problematic.
Why is that?
Rigorous meta-analyses, such as the comprehensive work by Creed and colleagues, have shown that grit is largely just a rebranded version of traditional conscientiousness, which we already discussed.
Wait, really? Just a rebrand?
Yes. It doesn't offer much new predictive validity beyond what personality psychologists have known about the Big Five for decades.
So it's old wine in a new, highly marketable bottle.
pretty much.
But wait, what about the famous studies? Because I've heard the stories about grit being the absolute deciding factor for cadets surviving beast barracks. The brutal initiation at West Point, or kids winning the National Spelling Bee.
This is where we return to the insights from the Zisman and Ganzak study, which exposes a critical statistical flaw in those early famous grit studies.
What flaw?
The flaw is a phenomenon known as restriction of variance.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English? How does restriction of variance skew a study?
Imagine you want to find out what makes a truly great elite basketball player.
Okay.
But instead of studying the general population, you only study players who are already starting in the NBA.
Ah, I see where this is going.
Right. By definition, every single person in your study is already in the top 0.01% of human height, athletic ability, and coordination.
Because they're in the NBA.
Exactly. Because their physical traits are all maxed out and nearly identical, those physical traits can no longer explain why one player scores more than another in that specific group. The only variable left to measure is who practices the hardest.
Oh, wow. So if you study West Point cadets, you are studying a population that has already been brutally filtered for high IQ, perfect physical health, and stellar academic records.
Precisely. In these ultra-elite, hyper-selected bubbles, like West Point or the finals of the National Spelling Bee, B intelligence ceases to be a differentiating factor because every single person in the room is already brilliant.
That makes so much sense.
In that highly specific vacuum, the tiniest difference in sheer stubborn perseverance grit becomes the deciding factor.
So where did they go wrong?
The researchers made the mistake of extrapolating that finding to the general population. They artificially inflated the perceived overall value of grit.
And when you look at the big picture...
And you zoom back out and look at the broader public, raw intelligence and basic conscientiousness absolutely dominate the equation.
That is fascinating. It's like measuring the importance of human breathing by only studying people running the final mile of an Olympic marathon and concluding that leg strength is the only thing that matters.
That's a very accurate comparison.
Okay, so what about growth mindset? This is Carol Dweck's massive concept. The idea that if you believe your intelligence is malleable and can be developed through effort, you'll view failure as a learning opportunity rather than absolute proof that you are inherently dumb.
Yes. The contrast is the fixed mindset, where people believe their abilities are static and therefore they flee from difficult challenges to protect their fragile egos.
Right, and we hear this everywhere in education.
And to be clear, at an individual psychological level, cultivating a growth mindset is beneficial. It aids resilience. But its role in addressing broader systemic inequalities has been drastically, almost dangerously overstated.
Really? What do the sources actually reveal about its limits?
The sources cite extensive data from the PIASA 2018 study, which spanned 39 countries and looked at hundreds of thousands of students.
A huge data set.
Yes. The data shows that the effectiveness of a growth mindset is highly dependent on the cultural context. But more devastatingly, macrostructural analyses show that a growth mindset barely makes a dent in the effects of structural poverty.
Define barely makes a dent, because we are told to teach this to kids in underfunded schools as a way to empower them.
The numbers are sobering. Having a perfectly optimized growth mindset moderates only about 2.9% to 3.2% of poverty's total negative effect on a student's academic achievement.
Are you kidding? Under 4%.
Yes. The implacable reality of the data is that a student from a wealthy background who suffers from a terrible, self-defeating fixed mindset will still systematically, predictably outperform a student from severe poverty who has a perfectly resilient growth mindset.
Wow. Mindset cannot buy textbooks. Psychological engineering cannot replace material resources.
It cannot.
It seems almost cruel when you frame it that way. Like you can't just mindset your way out of systemic deprivation.
It places an incredibly unfair burden on the individual. It demands that they mentally overcome massive structural deficits that they did not create, while giving society a pass on fixing the underlying material inequality.
That's a really profound point. Let's shift from motivation to the actual acquisition of the skills themselves. Because if we have the drive, how do we become experts?
Right, the methodology of mastery.
Yeah, there's a massive debate highlighted in the sources between two heavyweights on how to achieve mastery.
Yes, the debate over the architecture of expertise. On one side, we have K. Anders Ericsson and his theory of deliberate practice.
This is what Malcolm Gladwell famously and somewhat reductively popularized to the masses as the 10,000-hour rule. Right?
Exactly.
The cultural takeaway was basically, Pick a lane, start when you're 3 years old, practice flawlessly for 10,000 hours, and never look back.
Right. Erickson argued that expert performance is virtually never the result of innate talent. He claimed that mastery is the direct linear result of intense, exhausting, highly specific training sustained over decades.
What does that kind of training look like?
It requires breaking down tasks into micro-components, focusing exclusively on your weaknesses, and receiving immediate, precise, corrective feedback from a master mentor. Think of the classic story of Tiger Woods, who was essentially programmed for golf from the time he could walk.
Right. But the sources bring in a powerful counter-argument from David Epstein's work.
Yes, Epstein's brilliant analysis in his book Range. Epstein demonstrates that Erickson's model of early specialization and deliberate practice only works optimally in what he calls kind learning environments.
Kind, as in friendly.
Kind as in predictable and rule-bound. A kind environment, like a game of chess, a golf course, or playing classical music, has fixed rules, highly repetitive patterns, and feedback that is immediate and absolutely precise.
So if you hit a golf ball poorly, you immediately see it slice into the woods. You know exactly what went wrong.
Exactly. In these highly structured ecosystems, simply accumulating thousands of hours of highly focused practice is indeed the winning strategy.
But most of our lives, and definitely most of our modern careers, don't look anything like a chessboard. The rules aren't fixed.
And that is Epstein's core insight. In the modern professional world, we largely operate in what he terms wicked learning environments.
Give me some examples of wicked environments.
Think of leading a tech innovation team, practicing emergency room medicine, developing a business strategy, or trying to forecast geopolitics. The problems are ill-defined. The patterns rarely repeat themselves exactly.
And the rules change constantly based on human behavior.
Yes. And the feedback is often delayed, partial, or completely misleading. You might make a terrible business decision, but get a short-term bump in revenue, leading you to think it was a good idea.
So if you hyper-specialize early for a wicked environment, what happens?
You develop a fatal cognitive flaw. You become a victim of the law of the instrument.
Oh, the old adage that if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail.
Precisely. Epstein proves that in wicked environments, generalists triumph. Individuals who have a long sampling period, meaning they spend years trying many different disciplines, making educational detours, and accumulating a broad spectrum of varied knowledge.
They develop what?
They develop superior cognitive agility.
I can connect the dots between fields that seem unrelated.
Exactly. They utilize analogical thinking. They can take a solution from one domain and apply it to an entirely unprecedented problem in another.
Like someone who studies biology and then moves into computer science, using biological neural networks to inspire artificial intelligence.
Perfect example. In complex, turbulent environments, cognitive polyvalence, having many different mental models, beats narrow, rigid specialization every time.
Okay, so let's consolidate where we are. We've got the hardware, high processor speed and conscientiousness. We've got the software, autonomous motivation, and the cognitive agility of a generalist. Now, how does this person actually structure their Tuesday? How do they build their week? This brings us to the execution layer. How do the most successful people physically organize the reality of their 24 hours?
We transition here from internal psychology to actionable behavioral architecture. And the scientific foundation for this is goal-setting theory, formalized by Edwin Locke and Gary Latham.
Goal setting, okay.
It remains one of the most robust, thoroughly validated frameworks in all of organizational psychology.
But what does it tell us that we don't already know? Everyone knows they should set goals.
It proves irrefutably that setting specific, difficult goals generates systematically higher performance than setting vague goals like just do your best, or setting goals that are too easy.
But why? What is the actual mechanism in the brain that makes a difficult goal work better?
A specific difficult goal triggers 4 direct cognitive mechanisms.
Okay, lay them out for me.
First, direction. The goal acts as a ruthless cognitive filter. It directs your attention toward relevant activities and physically blocks out distractions.
Okay, second.
Second, effort. Ambitious challenges naturally mobilize higher levels of physiological and psychological energy. Your body literally steps up to the perceived threat or challenge.
Love that. Third.
Third, persistence. A clear, difficult goal drastically extends the duration you're willing to suffer through obstacles.
Then the fourth.
And fourth, task strategy. A difficult goal forces you out of your autopilot routines, demanding that you invent entirely new tactics to solve the problem because the old, easy methods won't reach the high bar.
Okay, so that's the theory. But I want to look at the reality. I want to look at the absolute apex of the corporate world, where time is literally millions of dollars. The sources detail a monumental study from Harvard Business School by researchers Porter and Oria.
Yes, this is a fascinating empirical look at executive time management. They didn't just ask people how they spent their time. They tracked 27 global CEOs, 24 hours a day, coding their activities in 15-minute increments over several years.
Man, it sounds exhausting.
They compiled an astonishing database of over 60,000 hours of tracked executive data.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because the absolute mythos of the billionaire CEO, the hustle culture ideal we see on social media, is the person who sleeps 3 hours a night, sends furious emails at 4 a.m., and is constantly, frantically multitasking across a dozen projects.
Right.
Does the HBS data actually support that image?
The data completely categorically shatters that myth. It reveals the true architecture of elite performance, and it is far more disciplined and far less chaotic than the myth suggests.
Okay, let's start with sleep.
First, let's address sleep. These top global CEOs sleep an average of 6.9 hours a night.
Almost 7 full hours. They aren't pulling all-nighters.
They cannot afford to. They understand that they must fiercely protect their biological capital. Their job is not manual labor. It is high-level cognitive decision-making and risk assessment.
And lack of sleep destroys that.
Exactly. Sleep deprivation physically degrades the prefrontal cortex's ability to navigate complexity, regulate emotion, and foresee long-term consequences.
What else did the 15-minute time tracking show about their days?
It showed a highly asymmetrical allocation of cognitive resources.
Meaning what?
Well, the worst managers are slaves to the urgent. They just react to whatever fire is in their inbox. But these elite CEOs structurally protect their time.
How much time are we talking about?
They spend an average of 30% of their total working hours entirely focused on proactive long-term strategy. They build physical walls around their schedules to ensure the daily operational fires do not consume their strategic vision.
And what about multitasking? The idea of being on a conference call while answering emails.
They actively, aggressively avoid it. The cognitive switching costs of multitasking are destructive to high-level thought.
So what do they do instead?
Instead, they utilize a technique called batching. They group similar low-level tasks like reading emails or returning quick phone calls into highly constrained blocks of time, maybe just 45 minutes a day.
And the rest of the time?
Most importantly, they fiercely protect periods of deep work. These are blocks where they are entirely isolated, uninterrupted, and inaccessible, allowing for deep, structural thought on single, complex problems.
It's not just billionaires either, right? The sources mention a study from King Abdulaziz University looking at top-tier university students.
Yes, they looked specifically at students in rigorous radiological technology programs, highly demanding academic environments.
And what was their secret?
The data show that the students with the absolute highest GPAs were those who planned their time almost obsessively. They utilized strict task lists, daily schedules, and calendars.
But the truly fascinating part is the psychological byproduct of that planning, right?
Yes, this external behavioral architecture significantly reduced their internal anxiety. By putting the chaos of their responsibilities onto a piece of paper, they created a calmer internal state that allowed their brains to focus entirely on the learning objectives.
Structure, paradoxically, creates psychological freedom. Okay, so let's look at the ultimate individual we've built so far. They have the high processor speed, they are conscientious, they are intrinsically motivated, they have a generalist's agility, they set hard goals, and they sleep 7 hours a night while batching their emails.
Sounds like a formidable person.
Right. If I am this person, I am bulletproof. I am guaranteed to win the game of life, right?
That is the ultimate assumption of the individualistic worldview. But here is where we must zoom out.
Zoom out how?
Analyzing human performance purely by looking at the psychology of the individual is like trying to analyze the speed of a ship without factoring in the ocean currents.
Oh, man.
We are about to hit the invisible systemic currents that push some people forward effortlessly while actively dragging others underwater.
We are entering the network ecology, social capital, and systemic determinism.
To understand this, we turn to the brilliant French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu and his theory on the reproduction of social inequality.
What was his main argument?
Bourdieu argued that success isn't purely innate, nor is it purely meritocratic. It is heavily dictated by the transmission of invisible inherited resources, which he categorized into 4 types of capital.
Let's break these down. The first one is obvious, right?
Yes, economic capital. This is straightforward, raw financial resources, generational wealth, property. It's the baseline capital because it allows you to literally purchase the other forms.
Like what?
You can buy private tutors, homes in better school districts, or the ability to take an unpaid internship in an expensive city to build your resume.
Yeah, that makes sense. But the second one is where it gets insidious. Cultural capital.
Cultural capital is arguably the most decisive factor in academic and institutional success. Bourdieu says it exists in 3 states. First is the habitus, the incorporated state.
Habitus, what is that?
These are the deep, durable, mostly unconscious dispositions of your mind and body that you acquire through early childhood socialization in your specific class environment.
I always struggle with this concept. How does a kid's habitus or background actually stop them from passing an objective math test or getting a job? Give me a concrete example.
It's not about knowing the math formula. It's about how you inhabit the institution. Habitus is the vocabulary you naturally use without thinking. It's your syntax. It's your innate physical confidence when you walk into a corporate boardroom or a professor's office.
Okay, I see.
A student from a wealthy background walks into an Ivy League seminar and feels an innate sense of belonging. They know how to banter with the professor.
Right. And the other kid.
A brilliant student from a working-class background walks into the same room and feels an overwhelming sense of imposter syndrome, afraid to speak because their accent or references might betray their class origins.
Wow. Okay. And the second state of cultural capital.
The objectified state. This is the physical possession of culturally valued objects, classical literature, fine art, a piano in the living room.
But just buying a piano doesn't make you cultured, right?
Exactly. Bourdieu makes a crucial point. Merely owning a piano doesn't give you cultural capital unless you already possess the habitus to know how to play it, appreciate it, and talk about it in polite society.
And the third state.
The institutionalized state. This is when the system officially recognizes your cultural competence by handing you a university degree or a prestigious professional certification.
The piece of paper.
Yes. These degrees function as the modern titles of nobility. They are the ultimate gatekeepers to positions of power.
So how does this framework actually create and sustain inequality?
Because the modern educational and corporate systems pretend to be perfectly neutral. They claim to judge everyone purely on raw, objective merit.
That they don't.
In reality, they implicitly evaluate individuals based on the habitus of the dominant upper classes. A child from a highly educated, affluent family possesses the secret code to school from day one.
So they have a massive head start.
The values, the language, and the expectations of their home life are in perfect, seamless symbiosis with the expectations of the teacher.
Whereas a kid from a working class background.
They experience what Bourdieu termed symbolic violence. The institution, subtly, or sometimes overtly, devalues their culture of origin. This provokes deep alienation and an internalized sense of incompetence.
And as they age, the economic disparities compound the cultural ones.
Exactly. The wealthy university student focuses 100% of their energy on studying and networking. The working-class student has to work 30 hours a week at a retail job just to survive.
Which destroys their study time and their sleep.
Leading to lower grades or dropping out entirely.
And then the system points to the lack of a degree and says, well, they just didn't have the merit. They didn't have the grit.
Precisely. This dynamic fuels what sociologists call credentialism, the fetishization of the diploma. The diploma formally legitimizes an exclusion that was actually based on economic and cultural disadvantage from birth.
Okay, the third capital is social capital, which leads us to some incredible modern data. And the fourth is symbolic capital. Let's touch on symbolic first.
Yes, symbolic capital is essentially prestige and honor. Its main sociological function is to make the possession of all the other capitals look natural or deserved, effectively masking the underlying unfair power dynamics.
But let's dive deeper into social capital. It's not just about having a lot of acquaintances, right?
No, it is about possessing a durable network of relationships that are anchored in high-status, influential groups.
And the sources highlight a massive, unprecedented study on this specific topic by Raj Chetty and the Opportunity Insights Project at Harvard.
This is truly a landmark piece of modern research. Chetty and his team analyzed an anonymized database of 21 billion Facebook connections.
Wait, 21 billion?
Yes. They use this unprecedented scale of data to map out exactly how social capital functions across every zip code in the United States.
How on earth do you even process that, and what were they actually looking for?
By using anonymized aggregate data algorithms, they were able to look at the socioeconomic status of individuals and trace the economic status of their friend networks.
What was the goal?
They wanted to answer a highly specific question. What specific type of social connection actually allows a child born into poverty to eventually escape it?
And how did they break that down?
They split social capital into three distinct types. First, social cohesion. This measures how tight-knit your immediate group of friends is. Second, civic engagement. How much people in your area volunteer or participate in community organizations.
And the third?
Economic connectedness. This measures the degree of actual interaction and friendship between individuals of high income and individuals of low income.
Okay, and what did the algorithms reveal?
The results were definitive and somewhat tragic.
Tragic. How so?
Civic engagement and tight-knit local communities, what the sociologist Robert Putnam called bonding social capital, had zero significant statistical impact on economic mobility.
Zero. So just volunteering at your local community center or having an incredibly supportive, tight-knit group of friends in your low-income neighborhood.
It isn't enough to escape poverty. The only form of social capital strongly correlated with upward mobility is economic connectedness, bridging social capital.
Meaning you need literal friendships that cross class lines.
You must have bridging connections.
Yeah.
Because cross-class networks are the primary conduits for transferring asymmetric information.
Give me an example.
A wealthy friend's parent tells you about an unadvertised internship. They provide high-level mentorship on how to act in an interview. They offer institutional influence.
But we don't really have that kind of mixing in society, do we?
No, the tragedy of modern society is that our geographic segregation, wealthy zip codes versus poor zip codes, and our natural human biases toward friending people who look and act exactly like ourselves drastically limit these vital bridging connections.
Okay, we've talked about the sociology. Let's talk about the biology again.
Yeah.
Because the lack of these capitals, the stress of being at the bottom of the system, doesn't just affect your resume or your network.
Right.
It literally shapes the physical structure of the human brain.
We are looking at the neurodevelopmental impact of the systemic environment. Advances in social neuroscience over the last decade have proven that poverty acts as a physical neurotoxin.
A neurotoxin, that's a strong word.
The sources cite a major study by Weissman and colleagues, which tracked over 10,000 American children across 17 different states.
And what did they find when they put these kids in MRI machines?
They found that a low family income is directly statistically associated with a physical reduction in the volume of the hippocampus.
The hippocampus. For those who aren't neuroscientists, that's the memory and learning center of the brain.
Yes. It is critical for the complex cognitive processes required for academic success and emotional regulation.
So poverty literally shrinks the learning center of the brain.
Furthermore, this structural reduction in the brain was correlated with significantly higher rates of internalizing psychopathologies, such as severe depression and debilitating anxiety.
The chronic stress just wears them down.
Exactly. The chronic, toxic stress of material deprivation, worrying about food, housing instability, neighborhood violence, literally stunts the biological hardware we discussed at the very beginning of this deep dive.
Now, I want to pause here for the listener. Looking at this source material, especially the next data point regarding social safety nets, it obviously touches on some heavy political debates.
It does.
Just to be completely clear, our goal with this deep dive isn't to endorse a specific welfare policy or take a political side. We are entirely impartial here, but we have to look at what the MRI scans in this specific study actually show when public policy changes.
And the data from the Weissman study points to a very specific macro-level finding.
What is it?
In states that had implemented generous social safety nets, meaning significant anti-poverty financial aid, housing assistance, and food security for families, the socioeconomic disparities in hippocampus volume between rich and poor children were reduced by 34%.
34%.
The data is clear on the biological outcome. These macrostructural policies act as powerful neurodevelopmental moderators. They shield the developing brain from the corrosive effects of chronic stress, essentially restoring a degree of neurobiological equity.
Wow. It proves that the hardware deficit in lower-income populations is not innate. It is environmentally induced and potentially reversible.
Exactly right.
Okay, so if the system is heavily rigged by invisible capitals and poverty is literally shrinking the brain's learning centers, what about the people who do break through?
The outliers.
The billionaires, the titans of industry. Is it just their pure, unadulterated merit that pushed them to the very top? This brings us to the ghost in the machine, the absolute most uncomfortable truth for high achievers to swallow.
Randomness. The inescapable mathematical role of luck.
It's hard to accept, isn't it?
It is. To understand just how much luck dictates extreme success, we have to look at the mathematical contradictions of human achievement as elegantly demonstrated by the Plutino computer model.
Walk us through the math here because it's fascinating.
The researchers, Plutino, Biondo, and Rapisarda, started with a very simple, observable statistical paradox. Human talent and intelligence, as we discussed with GMA, follow a normal distribution, a Gaussian bell curve.
Meaning, if you graph human talent, it looks like a bell. Most of us are average and sit in the big hump in the middle, some are terrible and sit on the left tail, and a tiny few are absolute geniuses on the right tail, just like human height.
Exactly. It's a symmetrical bell curve. But wealth and extreme success do not follow a bell curve.
What do they follow?
They follow an asymmetrical Pareto distribution, often called a power law. This is a graph shaped like an L, where an incredibly tiny fraction of the population holds the vast, overwhelming majority of the wealth, and everyone else is clustered at the bottom.
So the math doesn't map. If wealth was purely based on talent, wealth would be a bell curve too. The smartest person would be a bit richer than the average person.
Right.
But instead, the richest person is billions of times richer than the average person. Nobody's a billion times smarter than average.
Precisely. So to figure out why this discrepancy exists, the researchers built an agent-based computer model. Think of it like a massive simulation of the game, The Sims, designed to simulate careers over a 40-year working life.
Okay, I love this. What did they do?
They dropped thousands of virtual agents into this world. They gave the agents varying levels of talent, distributed perfectly along a normal bell curve. Then they hit play and introduced random events into the simulation. Both lucky breaks, like a great investment opportunity, and unlucky accidents, like an illness.
And who won this simulation after 40 years? Did the genius agents end up with all the money?
The model proved implacably that the agents who reached the absolute highest peaks of financial success were almost never the agents with the highest talent.
Who was it then?
The richest agents were inevitably individuals with perfectly average talent who had simply experienced a continuous, uninterrupted series of highly fortunate, random events.
The Matthew effect. The rich get richer.
Yes. We live in winner-take-all markets. If you get a tiny lucky advantage early on, it compounds.
Give us a real-world example of that.
A classic example is the hockey player phenomenon. If you are born in January, you are biologically older and slightly bigger than the kids born in December of the same year when you both try out for the Pee Wee hockey team at age 7.
Because of the cutoff dates.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because you are slightly bigger, you get selected for the elite training squad, you get better coaches, more ice time, and better competition.
And over time.
That trivial random advantage of your birth month compounds exponentially over a decade, resulting in massive asymmetrical success that has nothing to do with your innate baseline talent.
So to go back to my Monopoly analogy at the beginning, it's like we're playing a game where some players start with massive advantages, and when they inevitably win, they write a best-selling book on their strategy.
It happens all the time.
But why do the winners write that book? Why are high achievers so completely blind to the role of luck in their own lives?
The economist Robert Frank explains this through a series of deeply ingrained cognitive biases. It creates what he calls an illusion of personal merit.
Yes, the human brain is highly adept at protecting its own ego. Let's name the specific biases Frank identifies. The first is hindsight bias.
What's the best way to explain that?
Hindsight bias is the psychological tendency to look backward at your own success and reconstruct the narrative to make it look entirely rational, inevitable, and driven purely by your own brilliant choices.
You edit out the luck.
Exactly. The brain selectively deletes the memories of the sheer coincidences, the random email you sent on a whim, the fortuitous meeting in a coffee shop, the competitor who went bankrupt due to bad luck that actually paved your way.
The narrative of the self becomes a hero's journey, edited for maximum personal credit. The second cognitive flaw is the halo effect.
Identified by Thorndike and Ash, this is society's tendency to irrationally attribute global virtues to someone just because they succeeded in one specific, narrow domain.
We do this constantly in modern media. We see a billionaire tech founder who built a successful software company, and society instantly assumes they must also be a profound moral philosopher, a geopolitical expert, and a genius at urban planning.
We extrapolate narrow competence into universal wisdom.
Exactly. And the third bias.
The fundamental attribution error. When we evaluate ourselves, we attribute our successes to internal factors, our genius, our grit. But we attribute our failures to external factors, a bad economy, an unfair boss, bad luck.
But we don't do that for others.
Right. When we judge others, we flip the script completely. We view their failures as absolute proof of their internal deficiencies. They're lazy, they aren't smart enough. And we view their successes as just being in the right place at the right time.
Honestly, this psychological cocktail sounds like a recipe for creating some very arrogant, disconnected people at the top of the pyramid.
It does.
And it actually creates systemic institutional arrogance, leading directly to what psychologists Keltner and Krauss call the empathy gap.
The empathy gap, what is that?
Their experiments are chilling because they measure the physical reality of this arrogance. They demonstrated that as an individual's socioeconomic status rises, their physiological capacity for compassion literally degrades.
Wait, physiologically? You mean their bodies actually react differently?
Yes. In controlled laboratory settings, high-status individuals showed measurably fewer physiological signs of distress, like changes in heart rate or skin conductance, when witnessing suffering or pain in others.
That's wild.
They were measurably worse at reading facial emotions. In behavioral tests, they would aggressively monopolize shared resources. One famous test literally showed wealthy participants taking more than their fair share of a bowl of candy explicitly meant for children in another room.
Oh my goodness.
And they consistently exhibited highly disengaged body language, like constantly checking their phones or avoiding eye contact during interactions with lower status peers.
I have to admit, reading the Keltner study about rich people taking candy from kids, my first reaction was to laugh.
It sounds like a cartoon villain.
Right. But then I stopped and reflected on my own life. I realized I've definitely ignored a text from a friend who was struggling, simply because I had just gotten a promotion and felt I was too busy and important to deal with their drama. It creeps in. But why does wealth do this to the brain?
Because they don't need other people to survive anymore. Wealth is an insulator. Throughout human evolution, we relied on a complex web of social cooperation and mutual aid to survive starvation and predators.
We had to be hyper-attuned to the emotions of our tribe.
Exactly. But extreme wealth buys independence from that tribe. Because the wealthy individual no longer relies on others for survival, their brain literally desensitizes to the environmental signals of human emotion. Empathy becomes biologically unnecessary.
Which leads us to the sharpest, most profound critique of this entire system, the philosophy of meritocracy itself. The sources cite Michael J. Sandel, the renowned political philosopher from Harvard, and his book, The Tyranny of Merit.
Sandel pushes the sociological analysis to its ultimate philosophical conclusion. He argues that even if we could somehow make meritocracy function perfectly,
like perfectly fair.
yes, even if we magically eliminated all racial bias, eradicated all inherited wealth, provided equal cultural capital, and created a perfectly level playing field at birth, it would still be a deeply morally destructive and politically toxic system.
Why? If the race is finally perfectly fair, what is the problem with letting the fastest runner win?
Because of what the system does to the human soul and to the fabric of society. The core promise of meritocracy is that you will rise exactly as far as your individual talent and effort take you.
Okay, sounds good on paper.
But the dark, often unspoken implication of this doctrine is that it perfectly legitimizes extreme inequality at the finish line simply because the starting line was fair.
It aggressively divides the world into winners and losers and tells them they belong exactly where they ended up.
Yes, and look at the psychological state of both groups in this paradigm. The winners are consumed by the hubris we just discussed. They are utterly convinced that their triumph is a direct reflection of their superior moral and intellectual value.
They forget the luck.
They forget the luck. They forget the biological lottery of their GMA. But the consequence for the losers is far more devastating.
Sandel compares this modern system to the old aristocratic feudal systems, doesn't he?
Right. In an ancient feudal system, a peasant at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy knew that their miserable condition was simply the brutal, random accident of birth.
They didn't blame themselves.
Exactly. They didn't look up at the king and think, I am inherently intellectually and morally inferior to him. They just knew the king had better armor and a bigger army.
But in a true meritocracy,
The individual at the bottom receives a message of unprecedented psychological cruelty. The system is completely fair, you had every chance to succeed, and you failed. Therefore, your low status is entirely your own fault.
it is absolute undeniable proof of your lack of inherent human value.
It weaponizes humiliation.
It is an engine of systemic humiliation. And Sandel argues this transforms the political landscape. Welfare becomes punitive, designed to only help those who failed through no fault of their own, a virtually impossible standard in a meritocracy.
And credentialism infects all political discourse.
Right, with technocratic elites constantly telling the working class that the solution to globalization and job loss is to just go to college. This implicitly denigrates the dignity of manual labor.
Sandel argues that this burning, deeply internalized resentment against the hubris of the elite is the original matrix that birthed modern reactionary populism across the globe. It completely shatters the concept of a shared common good.
So we have thoroughly deconstructed this hyper-competitive, capitalist, Western definition of success. We've looked at the hardware, the software, the invisible capitals, the luck, and the ultimate moral failing of the meritocratic ideal.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. And for our final section, the deep dive takes a pivot. We're looking outside the Western paradigm to show that the location of the finish line is entirely culturally relative.
Because everything we've discussed so far, optimizing IQ, accumulating vast capitals, achieving vertical hierarchical climbing, the intense debate over individual merit, all of that is deeply anchored in a Western, liberal, individualistic epistemology.
Whoa, epistemology. So you basically mean the fundamental way the West views reality, knowledge, and truth.
Exactly. It's the lens through which we define a valid life. But cross-cultural psychology and anthropology prove that this lens is not a universal human constant.
The classic divide in the literature is individualism versus collectivism.
Yes, drawing on the foundational cross-cultural models of researchers like Hofstede and Schwartz. In horizontal individualist cultures, like the United States or the UK, success is fundamentally about abstract personal realization.
Standing out.
Right. It's about singularity, competitive accumulation, and ultimately secession from your group of origin. You define your success by how far you stand out from the crowd.
We literally celebrate the disruptor, the person who breaks the old system to build their own monopoly.
But in collectivist cultures, which we must remember actually make up the vast majority of the global population, spanning East Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East, the self does not exist in isolation.
How is it defined?
The individual is designed entirely through their web of social relations.
So if they don't want to stand out, how do they measure a successful life?
Not by disruption, but by flawless integration. Success is defined as social harmony. It is respecting complex hierarchies, fulfilling duties, and collectively elevating your reference group.
Whether that is your extended family, your village, or your company.
Exactly.
Yeah.
For instance, studies on career success across 14 different countries show a cultural metric called uncertainty avoidance.
What does that mean for careers?
In many of these cultures, a successful career is defined by stability, long-term security, and social respectability. They actively, consciously reject the Western metrics of volatile disruption and high-risk solo wealth accumulation.
The sources also note how this completely changes the emotional definition of a good life.
Yes, studies on subjective well-being are fascinating here. Western cultures view a successful experience, whether that's a vacation, a career, or a marriage, as the absolute maximization of positive emotion and the total eradication of negative emotion.
A pursuit of pure, unadulterated happiness.
Right. But Asian and Asian American populations tend to view a successful, fulfilling experience as one that dialectically integrates both positive and negative effects equally.
Acknowledging that struggle, sadness, and difficulty are actually necessary components of the good life, not glitches to be erased. Let's get into the 3 specific alternative philosophies mentioned in the sources, because they offer incredible counter-narratives to everything we've discussed.
Starting with Africa.
The philosophy of Ubuntu, rooted in the Bantu value systems of sub-Saharan Africa. The central guiding axiom of Ubuntu is, I am because we are, or translated another way, a person is a person through other persons.
It is the absolute, uncompromising antithesis of toxic Western individualism.
How does the philosophy of Ubuntu view the Western ideal? the billionaire who made it to the top of the pyramid and hoards their wealth.
It views that person as a profound tragedy. In the Ubuntu paradigm, the aggressive accumulation of massive capital by one individual while their surrounding community suffers is not seen as a meritocratic achievement to be celebrated on a magazine cover.
What is it seen as?
It is viewed as a monstrous moral anomaly, a sickness of the human spirit. True success is measured strictly by your degree of interconnection, your generosity, your compassion, and your preservation of the social ecosystem. An individual can only rise if the village rises with them.
That is beautiful. Moving from Africa to Japan, the sources highlight two profound concepts. The first is ikigai.
Ikigai roughly translates to your reason for being, the specific thing that gives meaning to waking up in the morning.
It's not a ladder to climb.
No, it is conceptualized as a delicate, balanced intersection of four elements.
What are they?
What you deeply love doing, what you are highly skilled at, what society actually needs, and what you can be paid a living wage to do.
It's not about becoming the CEO or the billionaire disruptor.
Not at all. It fundamentally eschews the vertical hierarchical climb. The success of Ikigai is found in the meticulous, meditative execution of small daily tasks.
So finding meaning in the everyday.
It is finding quiet, profound meaning in everyday utility and craftsmanship, rather than seeking global domination in a market.
And the final philosophy, which honestly might be the most necessary antidote for our modern, burnout-inducing anxiety, wabi-sabi.
Wabi-sabi is an aesthetic and spiritual philosophy derived from ancient Buddhist teachings. It is an invitation to embrace the transient, imperfect, and unfinished nature of existence.
It is the exact opposite of Instagram culture.
Precisely. Western performance culture demands an agonizing, relentless quest for absolute perfection. Flawless physical bodies, unbroken upward career trajectories, immaculate resumes, perfectly curated homes.
It's exhausting. What does wabi-sabi offer instead?
Wabi-sabi postulates that true authenticity, profound beauty, and real success lie in accepting wear and tear, accepting the inevitability of failure, and embracing a profound simplicity. It protects the human mind against the alienation of chasing an impossible, sterile perfection.
I want to ask you, the listener, to reflect on that for a second. Think about your current life, your job, your ambitions, the things you stress over at 2 a.m. If you applied the wabi-sabi lens to your current career stress, how would it change your definition of a good day?
It changes everything.
If you stopped needing tomorrow to be a perfectly optimized day of maximal productivity and just allowed it to be a slightly messy, unfinished, but authentic day, how much of that heavy anxiety would just evaporate?
It is a radical cognitive shift. When we synthesize everything we've explored today, from the neurology of the hippocampus to the algorithms of Facebook networks to the ancient wisdom of Ubuntu, we see that the question, why do some succeed more than others, forces us to abandon those romantic single-cause narratives.
Right. It's not just having the highest processor speed.
No, though GMA is a critical baseline for navigating complexity. And it's not just blind grinding grit. That burns out entirely without the autonomous motivation outlined in self-determination theory.
And it's not just locking yourself in a room for 10,000 hours of practice.
Because in our wicked modern environments, Epstein's cognitive polyvalence, the agility of the generalist, is what actually wins.
And even if you get all the psychology perfectly right, you are still navigating Bourdieu's invisible matrices of cultural capital and Chetty's economic networks of bridging social connections.
And above all, you are still at the absolute mercy of the Pareto distribution of luck. We must recognize the sheer biological and structural violence of inequality and dismantle the hubris of the meritocratic myth that Sandel so brilliantly critiques.
We really need the wisdom of Ubuntu and wabi-sabi to remind us that human value isn't a stock ticker.
Absolutely.
So I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. If our modern meritocracy is heavily influenced by blind luck, invisible inherited capitals, and a deeply ingrained Western bias for solo achievement, what would happen if tomorrow your workplace or your school started measuring success strictly by how much you elevated the people around you? Would the people at the top of the pyramid still be the same people?
That's a powerful question.
That's a wrap on today's episode of MindWire Podcast. Did today's topic spark any new ideas for you? Let's keep the connection going in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.